Today's episode is brought to you by our company, NanoChomp Marketing Strategy and Analytics. We help product and marketing teams solve problems and experience growth using data and approachable AI. Visit nanochomp.com to learn more. Hey everyone, today on Soundbites we have a great guest, John Rossman. John is an author, business advisor, and keynote speaker. He was an early Amazon executive who helped play a key role in launching the Amazon Marketplace business. His books include The Amazon Way, Think Like Amazon, The Amazon Way on IoT, which is a favorite of mine, and Big Bet Leadership most recently. Big Bet Leadership is an actionable guide for leaders who want to succeed in complex transformations. We're really excited to have you on today. How are you doing, John?
Derek, thanks for having me. Been nice to get to know you and Lauren.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming. Yeah, it's almost hard to pick a point of where to start. So let's start at the beginning. Like, how did you get to the point where you're at now? Where did you start, and what got you on your tech journey?
Well, God, I'm 60 years old now. Like, how far do you want me to go and stuff? But so I studied industrial engineering at Oregon State, and I've always been interested in kind of this intersection of efficiency, ergonomics, and kind of flow integration, right? Like, how do you get people, processes, machines, outcomes that work together, and always targeting kind of both a better, outcome for the customer, but also efficient and have quality levers, right? Like that's kind of the arc of my entire career. My first job out of college, I was a programmer for Accenture. It was Anderson Consulting at that time. It was actually MICD when I started,
Oh wow.
and I got to do just the edgiest work. I got involved in really early graphical user interface, Unix workstation design, and really kind of that design and systems integration work that I did the first 5 years of my career really is what got me into tech. And then I've kind of migrated to more like re-engineering and strategy work, but it all builds on that understanding of actually both how to design architecture that matters, and kind of in the book I talk about the entities, right, of architecture that you need, which are the capabilities of an architecture. So I have a deep appreciation for that, but I have a good enough understanding of actually, like, from the metal up, like how systems work and stuff. And that's been, helpful at times in the work that I do.
I think it's really important to understand things at a systems level, a building blocks level, and you see the interaction and interplay on how they all come together.
And that's not a throwaway line there that you just said, Derek. I'm gonna slow down and double click on it. Like that concept of reusable capabilities, whether it's a technology capability or a functional capability. That's really the Lego block concept of Amazon, right? And how they keep modularizing their business and their teams and their organizations. And it's one of the key ways that allows them to maintain small-ish teams and to be relative for a very big company now, a fairly entrepreneurial and fast-moving company, is
Sure.
because of this connection between service-oriented architectures and the teams that actually own and run services at Amazon. And it really is, a key concept. Amazon calls it a two pizza team. There's lots of ways to design this, but carefully designing processes and then functions and then steps, like that is an artistry and a capability that is essential to creating businesses that both scale but can also be transitioned along the way. They aren't brittle in nature, right? And you have this essence of kind of being anti-fragile, things that actually get better with chaos versus breaking with chaos.
Do you think the minds or the people who are really good at designing those processes and steps, do you think that's like a respected um skill set, or is that just something that people take for granted?
I don't think it's what people take for granted, but I also don't think it's highly respected. One of my favorite books is the Elon Musk biography that was done a couple of years ago and one of the things, there's two key concepts in that book that they kept coming back to, and I've used these a number of times with my clients, is Elon's focus on the machine that makes the machine, right? And so he wouldn't just focus on the rocket or the car. He'd be focused on the process that builds the rocket or the car, right? So then the machine that makes the machine, and putting in intense effort into designing that flow, right? And so that's the art that we're talking about here. And then the other is kind of Elon's algorithm, which is delete, 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 right? Like challenge every requirement, challenge every step, everything should be rethought. And that is a big combination of what we're talking about. Amazon's third leadership principle is invent and simplify. It's the and simplify part of that leadership principle in your processes, in your approaches, in your requirements, in your procedures, in your jobs, in your data structures. Like it's all of those things that need to be rethought and simplified, because simplified not only scales, but again, it can be transitioned over time.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people miss the simplify component of it. And even worse, when the people are trying to build a process, there's a lot of sunk cost into the way things have previously been done without questioning the first principles about what needs to be done versus what's been done.
Yeah, simple is not easy to get to, right? And it kind of gets to Lauren's question, like this is not highly respected, but it's the edgiest work I do, is kind of the decalcification of all the buildup of all this stuff over time, and especially in bigger companies that have grown through acquisition. They're just hustling to get things done. They don't take time to really rationalize, you know, their processes, the outcomes. Why do we do this? Shouldn't we partner to have this done? Like that kind of core versus context discussion and everything. And that's the type of work that we're talking about here. And that is operating model redesign and transformation, right? And so, the book is Big Bet Leadership, and it's about transformations. Sometimes these are innovations, like outward facing things, but a lot of times it's how to get to a more efficient operating model. And it's the redo of how we get work done. And I think that, and this gets to the premise of the book, which, the subtitle of the book is Your Transformation Playbook for Winning in the Hyper-Digital Era. Well, what's the hyper-digital era, and why do I think this is important? Because in the advent of AI and a couple of other mega forces, like the aging of our population and the indebtedness and committed spend of our country, I think what you're going to see is companies that are being able to be redesigned for a 10 to 100x level of productivity, like white collar, back office, mid office, front office productivity. And if you think about the past 25 years of digital transformation, we've really reinvented customer experiences really well. We've had a plethora of new business models. But the way work gets done, core productivity has been on a very mild upswing, right? Like 2% a year. I think that's going to change. You're going to see an upswing in productivity. Now, that's going to be painful because that means a lot of displacement and everything. But the companies that can figure out how to be systematic about their operating model transformation are going to be the big winners through this. And if you can't, you're going to be the loser. And that's why I think this concept of having both and being a world-class operator, but also a systematic transformation organization. And there's only a few out there that have been able to do that. That's kind of the ones that we know of are, we've talked about one extensively, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos in Amazon, John Ledger at T-Mobile, Satya Nadella at Microsoft. They have a playbook. We think they have three critical capabilities that differentiate them from other good operators. And that's really both why we wrote the book, why we think it's important, because you have to make transformation a core competency, and it's not today. And there is a pattern. There is an approach to this that is different. And that's the tricky part, is it sounds similar to the things you do as a good operator, but it's done with distinctly different kind of essence and focus areas?
Yeah, one of the well, a lot of things I liked about this book. Well, to start, I'll go back. Like before I even knew you, we had read The Amazon Way and The Amazon Way on IoT. We were running an IoT business. That was a playbook. Try to treat it as a Bible because it was really easy, approachable and
Cool.
consumable. And then when we got this new one, I was super excited. And when we were talking about right off the gate about outcome-based business models are kind of the future, and you're talking about these extreme digital transformations, resilience is going to be a big piece of the pie, and a core competency of being adaptable. One of the things we're looking at with all these AI tools is it's basically like a combine, a white collar combine harvester, right? You can use the tool effectively or it can run you over, right? And I think you're helping businesses being able to use it to maximize.
And it's going to fundamentally change agriculture, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good metaphor. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's that was like my big takeaway from reading your latest book. I was like, man, like this this changes the world just the way the internet did, and
Right.
the people that can adapt it and approach to it
And,
are going to win.
and you're starting to see the early trials and impact of this mindset, right? And so you're seeing functions within some companies, this concept of the 10x engineer, right? And marketing, like having a productivity boost based on kind of these Gen 1, Gen AI capabilities and everything, right? Like this is the starting point. This isn't the ending point on this. This is the starting point on this. And it's going to we're tackling kind of the work that is really well suited for the superpower of Gen AI, which is essentially kind of pattern matching and next best available word, right? Computer science programming that has very strict rules, right? So that's really well suited for the powers of Gen AI. Marketing and communications, those things, again, like super good fit to the superpowers of Gen AI in these early stages. But that's just part of the work that goes on within enterprises, right? And so now you're going to start seeing that. I think there'll be a trajectory with jumps and starts, but plateaus also, of adopting this into all of the work that goes on within enterprises. But again, you're already starting to see the impact of kind of these completely redesigned, outcome oriented, built for AI capabilities that are having the impact we're talking about, which is productivity levels that are significantly different than organizations who aren't creative and aggressive in the experimentation process that's necessary to get the results.
When we talk about like op model transformation and 100x boost in productivity and the potential pain that may cause, because of the displacement, how do we have conversations with those teams or those groups that maybe stand to be impacted the most, and what can leaders do or say or put in place to make it a little less painful?
Yeah. It's a super important concept. I'm going to unpack it a bit here and everything, right? So the fundamental challenge in these transformations is a lack of clarity in our thinking. When you don't have clarity in thinking, then you can't experiment well, you can't communicate well, you can't set expectations well. So the fundamental premise of the book is you have to build a big bet vector, right? A vector has 2 points, very specific points, well understood points. Our vector has the problem and our hypothesis for what the future state is. So when you have this big bet vector, then one of the things you're able to do is to be a much more effective strategic communicator. And my belief, to answer your questions, is you have to have authentic transparency with your stakeholders relative to the journey that you are taking. And if you do that authentically, consistently, and in a manner that's actually helpful. And by helpful, I don't mean communication that says we have to change or we have to innovate or we have to have better results. That's kind of like super empty calorie communication. But that's mostly what's delivered by executives when they're talking about these types of transformations.
Right.
And the problem is everybody makes meaning of that, right? And so they're taking in all these other signals and they're figuring out like, oh, does this mean a big layoff, or whatever the change is, a big change. But if you're actually super precise and consistent in here's the problem we're solving and why it's worthwhile, and here's our hypothesis about what the future state is, and here's the journey of experimentation that we are going to go on to prove this out, then you're actually taking the guesswork out of the impact relative to this. Now, again, depending upon the stakeholder and the situation, then you have to like complete that story for that stakeholder group. But you have the basis for actually calibrating and being directionally accurate in what we're doing, and that it's fundamentally a process of experimentation. I cannot commit to you that this is going to work or this is going to be the outcome. We are going to test it, but when we do, we will communicate it. Like that's the type of communication. And so this is such an important aspect of being a good leader for transformation that we wrote a chapter kind of dedicated to kind of both the culture and communication. And we liken it to kind of like the fundamentals of good teams, right? And so this is chapter 5, championship habits. And the quick recommendation is you have to be the chief repeating officer, right? Your job has to be in a story format with very intentionally relatable situations. Tell this story again and again and again. And if you look at these big bet legends, people that are systematic, they have a super natural orientation to keeping the main thing. And part of the way they do that is by the stories and the communication that they tell.
Yeah, we used this concept from your book very recently, actually. So we had a client who their leadership team would use language like, we got it under control, we're taking care of it, we're managing it, I'll handle it. So problems would come up, like, we're working on it, was the reply back. And in that leader's mind, it was, I always work and we always give a favorable outcome for the people involved. But for the people involved, there's still uncertainty in that gap. And finding a way to close that uncertainty is significantly better for your outcomes. And we were basically referencing your chapter in that.
Yeah. And, I come from a fundamental belief that, you should talk to adults as adults. And if the implications are obvious, don't try to pretend that it's not, and everything. Right. And that's part of adult-based communication is talking about the implications, but why we need to do this and everything. Right. And then again, depending upon the situation, you can come with, but here's what we're going to do with this extra capacity or this new talent or whatever it is. Right. But, the thing I know is you'll sleep well at night if you have honest, intentional, helpful communication. Like that's one of the benefits of going this path.
One of the things I think was when we were talking, was in your book, it's starting to blend together. But to that point, you were explaining to me a meeting you were having with Jeff Bezos, and he asked you a question about the growth in the marketplace. And you started to give him the answer, and he stopped you and he was like, the answer to that question starts with a number.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So this was in the Amazon way. And, we launched the marketplace business in for holiday 2002. So we launched it in early November or October with just the apparel category in 2002. So it's January 2003. We've come back from the holiday. We're doing our S team marketplace update, and Jeff turns to me and he goes, "John, how many sellers have we launched this year?" Well, it's early January, and so I start to explain. We didn't have any sellers in apparel to launch, and the new categories weren't ready to go yet. That was what I started with the explanation, and he obviously kind of reversed course, like, no, answer the question. So I said 6, and then he just took it as an opportunity. And he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the entire organization. In that S team meeting, that like, we can't let the simple things, the constraints in our business, be the hard things in the business, right? And we had allowed some of the simpler things to be the constraints relative to this business. And he was also encouraging me, like, John, although your title is director of merchant integration, you need to act like an owner, right? Like, think about the entire business and don't worry about putting pressure or ruffling feathers beyond your organizational scope. And it's like, I didn't need to hear it twice. It's like, okay, I've heard this, everybody else has heard it. So now when I start coming and talking to, whether it's the platform team or the business development team or whatever, about things that really aren't tied to my job, but they are to the marketplace, people now understand, like, I've been told, like, think like an owner, right? And so that's kind of the story. And that is
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm
that
curious,
is
just
hard in
thinking.
most companies, which is how to not let you, organization structures and job titles are good for some things, like essentially business as normal. But when you are driving change, it never works out, right? And so
Hmm.
if a good leader understands the limitations of org structures and job titles, and works to allow the messiness of just like acting like an owner, and getting comfortable with kind of that internal creative tension that you need to create, it's like a songwriting session, or a team. Like, you don't get better by just saying, oh, this is good enough, or this is great. Like, you get better by challenging to get to better. And you have to be willing to, have those, like, you want to talk about vulnerability. Like, vulnerability is like saying, like, A, I'm not good enough, this is what I need to do, and B, this isn't good enough, we have to do better. And that's what good teams do.
I'm curious if, you're mentioning your meeting back, I think you said it was like 2002, 2003, you were sitting next to Jeff Bezos, and that's kind of like crazy to think about now, just kind of knowing how large the company's gotten, and like how prolific of a person everybody knows who he is. So I'm
Right.
just curious, like, what, I guess that my question is, like, did you understand like the gravity of like the things that you were doing, and did they feel really big at the time, or in retrospect is that something you can look back and be like, oh, that was like, we were kind of at the forefront?
Yeah. Nobody saw what was coming for Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody saw what was coming for Amazon. And so we had a sense of urgency, because at that point the stock was $7, right?
Mm.
We had gone through a big crash. We were fighting for survival. The marketplace business was the third attempt at kind of this orientation or need to, like, we have to open up more categories, and we can't do it as a pure first party retailer. And there was a ton of naysayers, Lauren, like both
Mm.
external but mostly internal, people on the board, other senior leaders at Amazon, like, this isn't going to work. But it was really Jeff's willingness to be strategically patient but tactically impatient, to that let the marketplace take another crack. We finally figured out the right tactics to get to the outcomes that we were looking at, but it still took patience and a couple of other big bets
Mm.
to come into play that weren't on our drawing board at that time, right? And so, when the marketplace was launching, we weren't thinking about Prime, and we weren't thinking about FBA, fulfillment by Amazon, but it took those three things combined, and just letting the market develop, right? Both e-commerce market develop, but also customers to realize, like, oh, I don't just come to Amazon to buy books, music, video. I come there to buy apparel and home
Yeah.
decor and sporting goods equipment and musical instruments and anything, right? This is the marketplace story, is also the story of becoming the everything store and becoming a platform company. And so, he was the one that was willing to take the calculated risk. And at the end of the day, big bet leadership is really about how to be smart about taking these calculated risks. Even though the book is called Big Bet Leadership, the big is the size of the ambition. It's not actually the size of the bet, right?
Mhm.
It's about experimenting out the major concepts before you commit big to them. And that's why it I've had people point out to me, it's like, oh, this is really kind of the agile manifesto for enterprise transformation. And that's somebody else's interpretation, like, oh, that's an interesting spin on this, is how do you actually have high ambition on a concept, but understand that there are risks, dependencies, and unknown unknowns that you cannot commit to early. You have to go on this experimental journey. And that is the approach of this book, which is to have an experimental, but keep the ambition high. And those are two very difficult things to do.
I think about how that may be challenging, especially for publicly traded companies who have shareholders and boards. And I was thinking about, you said the stock price is at $7 and Jeff really had to make some calculated risks, but boards and shareholders are not looking for risks. They're looking for like predictable results, or for more predictability. So how do you navigate around
Right.
something like that?
Great question, and there's a ton of context in that question, but it can be answered. So on one point, it also gets to managing shareholders and your board through this type of strategic communication is part of
Yeah.
the playbook. So you have to manage those. Secondly, it's about resource allocation, and especially with the board and shareholders, being specific about a specific amount of resource allocation that is going to go to building the future of our company. And the reason we do that is for long-term competitive advantage and for long-term benefit. Therefore, you are going to see some dollars and some press in this area, all of which may not work and everything, right? I'm setting expectations now, right? And it gives them some basis to be calculating in. But this was, Big Bet Leadership was written by me and my co-author, Kevin McCaffrey. Kevin was my client at T-Mobile. He ran new business incubation at T-Mobile. So think of, T-Mobile is essentially this core wireless business. They needed to build businesses beyond the core. And what they did was they allocated a specific amount of resource it sounds like a big number, but in the context of a big business, it's not a big number. And that was Kevin's portfolio to take through this process of staged experimentation on new business models. And so we learned a lot of these things and applied a lot of the Amazon approaches into a company that distinctly did not want to be Amazon, either culturally or they were a much more kind of predictable outcome type of organization and shareholder base, and everything, right? But they still need growth. They still need competitive advantages. They still need to differentiate from their core wireless competition. And so this is the story and how we manage that situation, because what you're pointing out is exactly what goes on. But if what you just say as a senior leader is like, we're going to innovate and we're going to deliver growth and we're going to deliver predictable results, that depends on the business, depends on the context, but that can be a pretty tricky combination.
They're often at odds,
They're
right?
often at odds, exactly.
And when I think kind of another complication you run in on that, if you're not taking a big bet leadership approach, is you have people that will say, well, innovation happens by a genius because I would just give someone a faster horse. They always bring the faster horse argument up, but I feel like what they're fixating on is a type of solution versus the problem being solved, right? And I think when you're building a big bet vector, you're thinking about problem and hypothesis, and somebody is stuck here not getting fully to here. How do you help leaders get back to what's the core problem statement and get them out of what their current solution is to get them to that future state?
Man, you guys are asking the best questions. I think the art of staying in the problem space in order to really rethink things is a completely unexplored area of like what innovation means. And I did just a little bit in Big Bet Leadership, but there are other good frameworks and work that's done here. But just the encouragement of staying in the problem space a bit longer, and then when you're talking about solutions, start with some unconstrained perspectives. Don't always put constraints on it first, but we have a specific, kind of framework and set of recommendations on how to force yourself to boil down and stay in that problem space until you know the user or the situation well enough that you know the real, like what we call the what sucks of the situation, right? Which isn't just this set of like little pain points and short-term desires, but it's a deeper understanding of like what's the essence of what they're trying to get done, and how could you reimagine how they get to the essence being completed, right? That is the killer feature. And being able to write this stuff out is kind of the discipline of being able to think and then share in a collaborative way to get the best from everybody in a team into the situation, and you're bringing them along relative to what we might do on the situation. So that combination of stuff, but it really does, as you hinted at, Derek, is stays with understanding the problem better and rethinking it oftentimes from more first principles and user empathy standpoint. We reference the jobs to be done framework in our book because that tends to be a good framework in most business situations of really understanding your user better.
Yeah, I think it's easy for strategists, people that are the smartest people in the room, to dream up the strategy and then not break it down into those jobs to be done, not have the ability to get it into those very tactical, high impact things. And then they wonder why things aren't forming the way they need them to form.
Well, and because you starting from this very obtuse, abstract layer, one of the things you can't do with that strategy is you can't go, what are the 3 to 5 things that must be true in order to deliver the outcomes that we want, that are both high impact and high risk. And so if we had better clarity on these 3 to 5 discrete elements, we could test before we commit to this big endeavor, right? And that's that when you have just that top-down view of a strategy versus a bottoms-up, like from the user, the problem we're solving for them, then you can't break this up into a set of small steps to be able to better bring forward the high impact things that should be tested for here. And that again is back to the essence of the book, is like how to have high ambition, but test the critical things out first so that we can proceed in a much better informed manner, fact-based manner than a guess-oriented manner.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it makes a ton of sense. And I think too often,
and all too often, like what in these enterprise strategy teams do, and big plans and everything, is they forget that 90% of what they're proposing are assumptions and untested foundational elements, right?
Yeah.
And everybody else forgets that too. And that's where, the hockey stick plan comes from, and why people sign off on them is because we forget it is typically conjecture that we are basing that off of. And what we believe is you have to recognize that, not that those are bad plans, but you have to recognize them for what they are, which is it's a calculated risk. How do you become the shark at the table when you're dealing with calculated risk? Well, you gather more information than the other players at the table. That's what we're suggesting you do, is gather more information so that you are making better informed decisions on those things that are truly assumptions and guesses.
I think the assumptions and guesses point resonates quite a bit. And kind of an inside joke we have is um, data science and machine learning, they're written in Python, but AI is written in PowerPoint. Like we see a lot of these things put up in PowerPoint slides of like what the future is going to look like. And it's not all factual. It's we used to have a CEO would say, "I'm not afraid to take a single data point and call it a trend." And
Right.
there's a lot of that, right? But you have to be able to take that leap to test it. But you maybe don't go all in. Make it part of your vector, but test it safely.
And it is. It's like trust your instincts. This is big, but don't go all in, right? Like our final piece of advice in big bet leadership is be an active skeptic, right? Active meaning like you don't just ignore it, you don't just not apply any resources to it, but skeptic meaning you test. You fundamentally don't believe stuff until you've proven more of it out. Like skeptic doesn't mean negative. Skeptic means you want to pressure test things. You're a devil's advocate in not believing the hype, and it's the combination of those two things, especially in this era of AI, that the winners are going to be act, activity oriented, applying resources and enough resources, but they're skeptical. Like they actually want to see things working and learn. And they also understand is that as an organization, you have to build this capacity. You can't just say like, oh, now we want to be this test and learn, organization and go from 0 to 100. No, it's like any skill. You have to build it up over time. And so you got to start this journey while the business is good.
This is more of a personal question, but just listening to you, you have so many great insights, very much based on your experience. What was it like to sort of sit down and write these books that you've written? And what was that process like? And was it different than what you expected?
Well, being a writer was never on my roadmap, and everything,
Mm.
right? After Amazon, I was a partner at Alvarez and Marcel, a really nice mid-size consulting organization. And I left Amazon in late 2005. I became a partner at Alvarez and Marcel, started working with my clients, and I started to insert all this, like these little things from Amazon, not preaching the big concepts, but the little maneuvers and everything. And I wrote one white paper, and it was called Future Ready Self Service. And it was about the power of making a process or a capability self-service. And there's a ton of, back to this process design discussion that we had, thinking about how would I make it self-service so that somebody else could use my capability without ever talking to me and everything. Like that is a way to do the process design and everything. I wrote this one white paper and I sent it to my clients. And one of my clients at the Gates Foundation called me and he was like, John, this is really good. And then he gave me like 10 things I should have done better on it because he's an editor by background and everything. And his insight was, we're in Seattle. We kind of see the intensity of Amazon. And so this is 2012, right? Like several years after I left Amazon. And he goes, I think you ought to write a book about it because it's a powerful message to others. And I've seen how you apply these things for impact in our work and with our grantees and everything. So that was kind of the spark that got me to write the Amazon way. And I've been on a journey relative to how I write these things, and everything. And so I worked with a ghostwriter on that first book of the Amazon Way, and we self-published it, and it was ridiculously successful, but partially just because we launched it in 2014, and we caught the zeitgeist of Amazon,
Mm.
like becoming like, oh, this is, the company, this is the innovation company, and there's so much more than a retailer. And then I got these opportunities to start coming and doing keynote speeches. And so I started getting asked all these more detailed questions about like, well, how would Jeff think about this? How would Amazon do this? Like, what was the trick on this? And that's what led to Think Like Amazon, 50 and a half ideas. So Amazon Way and Think Like Amazon are kind of paired books together
Mm.
and everything. And that's the full playbook of like all these mechanisms from Amazon. And then Big Bet Leadership, during the pandemic, I was partially bored because I, couldn't get out and give as many keynote speeches, and everything. But I was like, there's more. I need to be more specific in the recommendations I make. In none of my prior books was I specific about this is what you should do. I was more like, this is how Amazon does it. You evaluate how to do it. And so in Big Bet Leadership, one of the big jumps I made in this book was being much more specific about the recommendation to be done. And we had learned all this stuff from T-Mobile and a few other situations. It was like more about like, how do you do this? And then the final thing I recognized, and the inspiration for the book, was large scale transformation or innovation is very different than incremental innovation or incremental projects. And there was not a playbook for senior executives on what they need to do differently for these major transformations versus incremental projects. And we saw that as a market need, right? And this book I wrote with Kevin McCaffrey, so I had a co-author, and that was we had worked together before, and one of the reasons we worked well together was because we were both very good at kind of thinking through a situation, setting a commitment, hitting a commitment, and because we had that trust of like, okay, I know how this person works, and we're gonna create a roadmap, create a scope, work at this as a project and everything. It went really, really well together and everything. So that was a little bit on kind of the book journey and my journey as an author. But I'll tell you, it's been as a habit of just writing. I write a newsletter too called the Digital Leader Newsletter. Like, it is so cathartic and rewarding and helps me think through things. And if you can't write it, you actually don't have a point of view, is my general perspective. And so it helps me test out ideas and go, John, what's your perspective on this? Hopefully it's unique and interesting. And that's, so writing is like, this habit that I've fully bought into to think better.
Yeah, I love that. And like, I think, Lauren's background in journalism kind of lines up perfectly with some of those thoughts. And one of the things you talk about, self-serving, or making those
self-service, not self-serving.
Self-service, yeah, that's what I meant. Like the self-service processes, we call those dog with a note workflows.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
I love
so
that.
but very really similar, and we had to come to that same conclusion again, like coming up to like, if I'm not here, how can I have somebody else do this without any instruction? It's like if you take a note and you can pin it to a dog's collar and send them off, if they can deliver that message, then you've got the process defined. And if they can't, you probably need to think through it a little.
And that was kind of our litmus test was, can somebody find it, install it, use it, and operate it without ever talking to you? Like, that's self-service in a nutshell. And when you think about what's my function and build the design of that, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and then you say it has to be self-service, well, you're gonna have a very deliberate approach to designing the work that goes on, whether it's automated work or human-driven work, typically a combination. You're still operating it like a well-defined capability. And I think back to the very start of this conversation, that is a super critical, underappreciated skill and art in business. If you read Amazon's last shareholder letter, so the most recent one that Andy Jassy wrote, he talks about kind of this fundamental orientation to how they design their capabilities this way.
Really
interesting. Maybe let's link to that in our show notes, Derek, so we can make sure everybody reads that.
And I'll send you guys the link to my newsletter that talked about that shareholder letter. So it's the kind of pulls the essence of it out.
Oh, fantastic. So the way we typically like to wrap each episode is with two questions, and this is my personal favorite. If you could have dinner with either the 18 or 25-year-old version of yourself, what advice would you give them? What would you tell you, knowing what you know now?
Bet on yourself earlier, which ironically is the advice. I've got two boys that are 26 and 24, and that's the advice I give them. And that doesn't mean you have to be an entrepreneur, but do things that have more calculated risk in them. And so that's what the advice I would give to 25-year-old John Rossman.
Because do you feel like you wish you had done that previously?
I played it too conservative for too long.
Hmm.
And I thought, having a job was the goal, and everything, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you can always get a job, and everything, right? Doing the right work is the goal.
I think it's so hard, you know, for especially for certain people. Like when I first came out of school, it was like I have $60,000 in debt. We have bills to pay. Like I need the job. But to your point, like the jobs are always there. It's how do you find the thing that you're
And
destined to do?
I grew up in a very constrained household. I
Hmm.
graduated school in 1988 when jobs were scarce, and so
Yeah.
I had a scarcity mentality. And I still work to not have that scarcity mentality, but to
It's
kind of
ingrained. It's
think
ingrained, especially when when you grow up that way.
when you grow up that way. My parents were, you know, World War II, Depression era
Yeah.
people. Like they grew up in hard times, and so we always had kind of this, you know, it wasn't a think big household. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Very much
And when
understand
you,
that.
with that mindset, you end up not wanting to explore the paths. You don't want to take the risk. You're like, okay, I've got this thing. It's safe. We're going to eat. Okay,
Exactly.
I got it. And
That-
failure feel like in my world, we came from the same area in Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. But like in my world, it was like when you failed, there was no that wasn't great. It wasn't like, okay, we'll try again. It was
Right.
like,
Right.
so you get that got beaten out of you fast. Like failure is negative. And
That's
but to
right.
your point with big bet leadership, like you make those vectors and you dream big and you test small, so those failures are survivable.
That's exactly the system, right? Like they have to be survivable. As an enterprise, you need to be taking these calculated, survivable risks. You need to have a system, like an approach for how you do it, and it fundamentally starts with senior leadership and them understanding the role that they have to do and how it's different than their kind of incremental approaches to things.
Yeah, really love that. And so this is the very last question, and one of the other fun ones. Like besides your books, what books are you reading? What podcasts are you listening to? What media is consuming your time these days?
Yeah. So I just finished the book Surrender by Bono of U2, and that was a really interesting audiobook
Interesting.
to listen to and everything, because I've always been a U2 fan, and just hearing his personal journey and everything. I'm right now listening to Liftoff, which is the story of SpaceX, the early days of
Hmm.
SpaceX, and very
Oh, cool.
much enjoying that. And then one of the podcasts that I really enjoy is the Acquired podcast, which is, the story of great brands um, and founders behind them. And they tend to be a 3 hour plus, but it is true history, and they do a very good job. Pulling it back into the essence of this discussion, they recently had Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks,
Right.
on, and he gave a clinical diagnosis
Mm.
as to the problems at Starbucks. And I think that this was typically you get CEOs or ex-CEOs, like they play it very safe. They don't
Sure.
really tell you. But Howard said, he goes, the problem at Starbucks is they stopped going on the offense, and just like a good sports team, stopping your offense is the worst thing you can do. And then he said, and it's related to another thing that happened at Starbucks, which is we became hubris, and
Mm.
we started thinking that we had all of this figured out. And that's paraphrasing from him, but I thought that was just the most clinical diagnosis of, like, when you stop taking um, calculated risks, and when you think, like, we're not going to suffer from the innovator's dilemma,
Hmm.
like we're pretty good, and everything. That's when you are most at risk, not just from a business model standpoint, but from a culture standpoint, right? Because
Yeah.
the culture starts thinking we deserve this. Like, you don't deserve this. You only deserve what you earn, and everything,
Yeah.
right? Like, you've been given a gift. Your job is to make it a better gift for the next employees and shareholders here. When you start approaching that from a stewardship standpoint, like, you start challenging, like, how you do things, and no matter where you're at, there's a better way to do it, and you keep investing in the long term versus having these short term optics to it.
It's so funny because I was reading in a book a while back about how good management, textbook good management, is what generally kills great companies. It's like, they're trying to be a steward of finances and resources, and they're doing the MBA math, and they're looking at the internal rate of return, and then they don't take those risks because they're making a proven choice. This is a good choice to make, and that's usually
and,
not.
and that was absolutely in Howard's longer conversation relative to this, which is, when you start managing to earnings per share as like your North Star versus customer delight, and everything, you might short term. That's short termism, right? Like, that is the definition of short termism. Like, short term, you might deliver better financial results, but long term, you're probably eroding brand and equity value.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just
Well,
gave me a
John,
new podcast to listen to. I just subscribed to it, so I can't wait to listen to that episode
Well,
specifically.
those are good long road trip
Yeah.
podcasts. Yeah.
Or in my case, walking my dog, which I feel
Okay.
like I'm just constantly doing. So that this is perfect for me.
well, John, this has been awesome. I think, like, the knowledge that we got to get from you, the conversation, hearing the journey, really fantastic. Really appreciate the time today and had a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, you guys are great. Thank you for the conversation. I look forward to figuring out how to put it to work out there.
And then we'll link to where we can find you. So your LinkedIn, your webpage, and the latest book on Amazon of Big Bet Leadership.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you so
John.
much.